Okay, we're still in week 4 and we're discussing again some of the major theories that are utilized to describe the family and explain familial relationships. I just want to let you know my dog is here with me, so if you hear any strange noises, that's coming from him. Okay, we talked about structural functionalism in the last lecture, and I referenced Karl Marx often in that lecture, or a few times in that lecture. But we're going to go ahead and talk about him now because it's good to point out some of the contrasts between the two. Basically, social conflict perspective, as it's called, I believe it's called in your book, is based on the writing of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, most people don't like it when you say the word Marx, and they don't like thinking about Marxist ideas. But in actuality, I would argue that we actually have adopted more Marxist ideas than we think we have, and we probably think of the world through a slightly Marxist lens more often than we think we do, or we see the world through a Marxist lens. And mainly that's because Marx emphasized the importance of stuff, of economic reality and how we sustain, of money, on social interaction and on social structure. And most of us, I think, can see that argument, or we can see some truth to that argument. I usually like to ask my face-to-face classes, how many of you think the OJ trial was influenced by the fact that he had money? And most people believe it was influenced, regardless of whether he was guilty or you believe he was guilty or innocent. We would all probably agree, well, he had money. And that made his experience in court as a black man quite different than the experience of a black man without money when they go into court proceedings. So money matters, and that's kind of at the kernel, the heart of Marxist theory. I also like to point out that Marx, while he was a political activist, and he certainly wrote a lot of editorial pieces in the paper. He was an economist, a philosopher. He wrote books. He didn't try to implement Marxism in Russia, China, Cuba, the Eastern Bloc. Those were applications of Marxism that I believe Marx would have rejected himself. And in fact, at one point, he said in one of his pieces, he said, well, if a Marxist is everything that's being cited as a Marxist, then I'm not a Marxist myself. I mean, he understood that many of his ideas were being used in ways that he didn't agree with. His ideas were being interpreted in ways he didn't believe they should have been. He wrote books, and he didn't carry out the pogroms in Russia under Lenin or Stalin, and didn't commit those atrocities. So I like to try and destigmatize a lot of the writings of Marx and the ideas of Marx, because in America we do not always come to those ideas from an unbiased perspective. But basically, again, the idea is that money matters. One of his main criticisms of social theories that would argue, I wouldn't say he's directly criticizing Durkheim, but he would say that all of these ideas and all of these theories that say that society works towards some kind of order is false. There is no equilibrium. There is no system. There's power. You can't imagine a system like a puzzle where all the pieces work together, because some pieces actually have more power than other pieces. And when we remove the idea that power is part of the system that we work in, then it's no longer real to life. It's just an idea, a nice, pretty idea, but it doesn't explain reality. So he says conflict that arises from powered and empowered relationships, not equilibrium, is what is at the heart of any social system on a grand scale. Now, he doesn't mean it's necessarily all out war, but conflict can be seen too as varied interests or the battle of political and economic interests. But conflict, not equilibrium, not stability, is one of the fundamental attributes of society. Um, okay, I'm looking at the other points, and it looks like we've kind of covered them. For the most part, he would say that social conflict is necessary, and it's necessary for social change. Now, to try and get a sense of what he means by this, Marx is writing from what he calls a dialectic materialist perspective. He was a dialectical materialist. And what that means, the materialist part means that things, I'm knocking on my desk, stuff matters, material reality, where we live, what we have, all of the things around us shape our reality. So it's real. It's not our ideas, it's not our values, it's not some pie in the sky notion of what we would like. Real stuff is what shapes our reality. And the dialectic comes from the idea that when we approach our material reality, we'll see problems. And there'll be systems of, there'll be issues, conflicts, problems, inequalities, and we'll work to try and change those. And when we come up with a solution that will change it, we'll actually build into that change some new problems. And then we'll move along the circle, and eventually those new problems will come to the fore and create conflict. We'll have to try and solve that conflict, and in doing so, we'll create new problems. And we'll have this kind of cyclical way in which we'll move society forward. You know, kind of if you see a circle that's kind of rolling forward, or a tire that's rolling forward, we're moving through systems of problems, solutions, change all along the way. So he would say we had a capitalist system developing that produced inherent conflicts and relationships. The solution to those conflicts were being worked out in what he believed the Industrial Revolution that would lead to a more socialist, a more modified system of capitalism, which might lead to communism, where all social property is shared. But because he was a dialectical materialist, he would say, okay, the dialectic part, even within a communist system, we would be building in problems into that system, which would create conflicts, conflicting values, conflicting interests, and then a new system would need to be developed. I mean, so I would argue Marx would have said all doesn't end in communism, that it will. Okay, I think I accidentally hit the off button, so we're going to continue, and hopefully this will work out. So what are some of the sources of conflict? Well, he would say that all social relationships, and therefore all conflict, comes from our position to the means of production. Now, what that means is the means of production is simply the way in which society sustains itself. How do we support ourselves economically? How do we meet our social and physical and biological needs? Previously, we might have said through an agrarian economic system, farming, land ownership, the ability to buy and sell land, to buy and sell farming products. Okay, so that would be an agrarian system of production, and our relationship to that means of production would determine our position in society, our social interests, our economic interests. If I own land, I would have more power. I would have a greater, more economic autonomy than someone who simply was a slave or rented land and owed me percentage of food based on, for rent for the property. When Marx is writing, he's writing during the Industrial Revolution. And so the means of production then is industrial production. And so he says our position to industrial production and the process of industrial production establishes or serves as a foundation for all of our social relationships and our lived reality. Now we would say we might live in a service economy or a financial economy, so that our position to the means of production to financial services would be one way to think of how we can define how our experience is shaped. What our economic position is related again to the current means of production. Okay, but based on Marx's idea, where again he's writing in the Industrial Revolution, the means of production is a factory. He would say the capitalist or the bourgeoisie are those who own the means of production. They own capital. They have capital. They have the money to make more money. They can build a factory, and from that factory they can make money. So their contribution to the system is capital. They're the capitalist bourgeoisie or the capitalist class. A good example of this is I like to say, when you go to Vegas, who wins in Vegas? And normally the people who win in Las Vegas are those who have money. It takes money to make money. So those who are capitalists are able to make more money in the market than people who don't. If I go to Vegas and I play penny slots, and my max outlay is like $30. I went to Vegas once and I decided I'd spend $30. Of course, I made nothing because I spent nothing. If I really want to make big money in Vegas, I have to be able to buy into the major poker games. I need to shell out a lot of money in Vegas to make some money back. And the same is true of the stock market now. If I want to make a lot of money on the stock market, I need to have a lot of money to invest in the stock market. My small investments in the stock market through a retirement plan might grow, but they'll never grow to the extent of a large investment, the amount of money a large investment can accrue. So the capitalists are those who own the means of production. They own capital, and they can use that capital to in turn make more capital. The proletariat are those whose only capital is their labor. The only thing they have to make money, the only thing they own in order to make money with, is their labor. And today we could say for most students, an hour's labor is worth about, I think it's $7.75. Forgetting exactly what the minimum wage is. If you're a waiter or waitress, it's $2.15 plus tips. So the proletariat only have their labor to sell. And that the essence of this relationship, or the nature of this relationship, the interests of the capitalist class is different from those of the proletariat, and the opportunities of the capitalist class are fundamentally different than those of the proletariat. The proletariat, if we're only selling our labor, we're not likely to ever gain capital. I mean, real capital, to have enough money to make a lot of money, because the value of our labor is simply not. It's again like the Vegas analogy. The value of my labor isn't enough of an investment to make a lot of money. So simply because of our economic position, our differences in position to the means of production, we develop different interests, and those different interests create conflict. Now that class interest, he calls it class consciousness. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't see class consciousness as a bunch of people rallying together and say, oh, we're all rich. Yay, yay, let's have a big party, we're all rich. Class consciousness can be very, very subtle. And again, it has to do with shared economic interests. How do I know I'm part of this group? And normally it's because of how I define my economic interests. It might not be because I like people who are in this economic position. It might not be that I even know people who are in the same economic class as I am or position as I am, but I share interests with them, and my interests as a member of this class consciousness, will differ from people in other economic positions, other classes with other interests. And let me give you an example of that. When we think about buying a house, this often gives us a tip as to what groups we share economic interests with. As a sociologist, I know that communities that are mixed class, or made up of people with mixed incomes, various levels of income, are actually very helpful in promoting the economic advancement of the poor. So, in order to help those who are poor gain access to more resources, more public resources, better public resources, school systems, better roads, better libraries, better things that just increase our standard of living. One way to do that is to encourage communities to have a mixture of people of economic resources in the same neighborhood. So maybe one house, one or two homes are owned by those who are very wealthy. We have some that are owned by those of middle income, lower income, and then some who might be owned by those who would, according to the census, actually be considered poor or in poverty. And what happens is, again, because we have more of a higher tax base, the schools have more money to work with, as opposed to having a poor neighborhood where everyone is poor and you have little tax money to use to pay for the education system. And like I said, other public resources, those who are impoverished gain more access to better goods and services. Now, I'm committed to that idea. I love that idea, and I believe that it's true. The hypocrisy comes in that that's not in my class interest. And again, I'm admitting it's a hypocritical position that I'm taking, but it illustrates well my class interest, and how my class interest, like Marx was saying, our ideas aren't really what shape our reality. It's our class interests, our material position, our position to the means of production, our material reality that shapes our real world existence. The reality is that if I own a home, I want those property values to remain high. I want to be able to sell that home for as much or more as I paid to get into that home. I want to make sure that my neighbors have enough resources to keep their home maintained, to keep it painted, to keep it in good repair. I don't want to live next door to a home where things might go awry or might fall into disrepair. And I'm not saying that I don't want to live in a place like that. I mean, next to a home like that. I'm saying that in terms of economic interests, when we buy homes, we think about protecting our economic assets. That's a classed interest. I don't necessarily like my neighbors. In both neighborhoods I've lived in since we moved to College Station, I don't even know most of my neighbors that are on that street. I can't say that we share the same values, or we share the same ideas, or we share the same commitment to causes or different things like that, but I do know we do share an economic interest, and we share an economic interest in that we all own property that's adjacent to each other. That's what we mean by class consciousness, and that's what Marx means by just being in a particular classed position that shapes our interests, and those interests are in essence in conflict with each other. Different groups with different economic interests are essentially in conflict with each other, and this tension shapes all of our social relationships. Again, just to kind of explain a little bit more about how this relates to the family, because that's probably a big question right now. How does all this relate to the family? He says that, again, the economic structure provides what's called a base. And upon this base, the foundation of the rest of society is built. These economic relationships set into course a particular set of interests out of which we'll all act, and off of this, on top of this, every other social institution. He wouldn't have used the word social institution, but that's, for lack of a better word now, that's what we'll call it. That's what all these other social institutions are dependent upon: our relationships to production, the means of production, and how our interests relate to those things. And so he says that the influence of the economic system permeates every other aspect of society. Let me give you an example. If we were to call this a house and we're building on a foundation, then the base would be considered, again, the means of production and our relationship to the means of production. What class are we situated in? Are we those who, and this is very simplified, it becomes more complex, particularly later as people are writing using Marxist theories and applying them to more modern circumstances. But do we own capital? Do we have access to wealth? Do we sell our labor? How do we, and in what type of economy do we have these relationships? Upon this base, everything else becomes built. The education, religion, family, media, politics, and that would be called the superstructure. So things which seem to not have clear relationships to economy, theology, religion, even the movies we might watch or not want to watch. Those things all are dependent upon these fundamental economic relationships at the base. Let me give you a couple examples of how pervasive this is. When we think about how the economy and economic relationships have permeated everything, we can see that they've especially affected how our families operate. When I think about parenting, my kids are both 12, one set to become 13. And I think about how we've parented them over the age. And if you have kids and you've read any kind of parenting books, you'll know that parenting advice now comes in. The big thing now is to set up some system of rewards. So you have basically an exchange, and they don't call it an economic exchange, but in essence, it's kind of I'll pay you to do what's good. And I might not pay you in money. I might pay you with an M&M, or I might pay you with a trip to the park. But there's an exchange that's going on in that relationship. You behave this way, and then you'll be rewarded in that way. Now, that has a clear relationship to the means of production. I sell my labor. I work, and I get a reward. I have an exchange relationship with the owners of the means of production, one that has become replicated now in family life. Even when we think about housekeeping and house cleaning, family life has become very the market has permeated every aspect of even how we clean our home, and the role of the woman as the buyer of stuff in the family as part of that. We have a tool for every task in the house. Even though we might be able to clean the whole house with a gallon of diluted bleach and a couple of sponges, which might all cost, maybe $3. I guess we can't clean wood, with that. But for the most part, we could probably clean our house relatively inexpensively. We have a Swiffer to do the job. We have, specialty sponges. I'm trying to think. I have cabinets full of specialized cleaning products that don't get used, unfortunately. But the idea of that, even cleaning our home, is a process of consumption that we consume in order to clean. Is something that we could say is based on an economic system that is designed to benefit particular interests in particular ways. So family life can be very, very influenced, and Marx says is based upon these economic relationships. Okay, I've talked a little bit about this already, but we would say even the family relationships would be influenced by the base, would be influenced by power and relationships and the conflict that's embedded in relationships in the economic realm. So, for example, if there's ownership and power and those are important, and the economic sphere, then they're also going to be replicated and important in the family sphere. And we see that that does occur, that age and sex differentiation of roles occurs. I'll give you an example of that. Actually, this whole differentiation of roles occurred to some extent, but we see this whole idea of breaking down tasks kind of to their essence, and one person being responsible for very specific tasks coming about around the time of the Industrial Revolution. It's called Fordism or Taylorism. We see that has gained traction in a new and kind of different way in family life. So we have sex differentiation among roles. Boys take out the garbage, girls do this, moms do that, dads do that. Roles and power, or powered relationships, can be reflected even in the jobs that we do at home. Marx didn't write specifically a whole lot about marriage and family, but he worked with Engels. In fact, they were writing partners, and Engels supported him. Engels ironically owned a factory and wrote a lot with Marx, and they were close colleagues and close friends. And after Marx passed away, Engels compiled a lot of his writings and then fleshed out some of his ideas that he hadn't yet put down to writing but had articulated. And Engels even argued that monogamy, which was introduced to protect inheritance, that monogamy was established so that paternity could be established and then inheritance rights could be protected, but that it was also an expression of power. So women's inheritance could be controlled through those monogamous relationships. He also argued that women's sexuality was also controlled within a marriage, and that their economic contribution to society was not recognized, and that basically they were free labor, or he went as far as to say that they were like prostitutes within a marriage that labored for food and sustenance, but really their work had no other value outside of the home. Okay. So what are some of the conflicts that occur then because of these relationships and families, or how do we see this if society is based on this system of conflict, problems, this dialectic? We have conflict, there's embedded problems, social tension. How do these social tensions then get reflected even in terms of the family? You might have some opinions of your own. I mean, certainly the economic relationships between parents and children are sources of conflict in many families. Marriages are often thought of as economic institutions and relationships. We might enter into marriage thinking in terms of economic support. If we were to look at these kinds of conflicts from a Marxist perspective, it would all tend to come back that what's causing the conflicts in these familial relationships, it would be, and I don't mean what causes people to fight. I mean fundamental differences in power and access to goods and services within the family. Marx would say, again, they have to do with our economic position and our economic class. Okay, that's it for our lectures on theory. I'll be posting a third PDF. The material and the PDFs provide notes for the last part of our book reading, the chapter in Eschliman. So they correspond really closely to this last chapter or this chapter on theory. So I'm not going to record the lecture for that, but if you're worried about the exam, those lecture notes and the readings go hand in hand very closely. Okay.